This story is about murderers from England who were in love with each other and dedicated their lives to killing children. Working as a team, the lovers lured them into some secluded places and then subjected them to horrifying tortures. Even after being arrested, the criminals found a way to torture teenagers, and well-known British politicians tried to get them out of prison. We are talking about Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Ian Brady was born on January 2, 1938 in the Scottish city of Glasgow. His mother, Margaret Stewart, worked as a waitress, and there's no information about his father. According to his mother, he was a local journalist and died 3 months before the birth of his son. Realizing that she wouldn't be able to raise a child all on her own, Margaret gave her 3-month-old Ian to the Sloane family. They already had 4 biological children, but they accepted the boy. Ian took their last name, but continued to see his mother on a regular basis. At the age of 9, he and his family moved to the city of Pollock, where he started going to a local school. From very early childhood, his acquaintances noticed that Ian exhibited cruelty towards animals. Later, they described all the terrible things the child had been up to. At school, he started to behave even worse. He broke into other people's houses twice, and the police had to deal with him. Alas, the future criminal wasn't punished in any serious way because of his age. In addition, Ian constantly bullied younger kids. At the age of 15, he left school and got a job as a waiter in a tea house. Not even a year passed until the boy decided to change his job and became a butcher's assistant. At the age of 16, he ended up in court again. His girlfriend, Evelyn Grant, went dancing with a different guy, and Ian threatened her with a knife for that. The judge put him on probation on one condition: the young man had to live with his biological mother. That's what he did. He moved to Manchester to live with his mother and her new husband, Patrick Brady. As you have probably guessed, the future abuser took his stepfather's last name. He got him to work as a fruit porter at the market, but Ian didn't like hard labor. A year after he moved, he was caught by the police for stealing a bag of lead seals. The young man was going to sell them on the black market and earn some extra money, but instead of money, he got his first real sentence. Considering that at the time of the crime he wasn't yet 18 years old, the judge sentenced Ian to 2 years in juvenile detention. While serving his sentence, the young man somehow managed to get alcohol in prison and got drunk. He was transferred to a stricter institution because of this, and that's where he finished serving his sentence on November 14, 1957. Back in Manchester, Ian changed 2 jobs, but he was drawn to something different. Deciding to become more educated, he started reading books. But not all of them were good and helpful. Adolf Hitler's book Mein Kampf became one of his favorite books. Moreover, he liked books about Nazi crimes. Myra Hindley was born 4 years after Ian on July 23, 1942, in one of the districts of Manchester. Her family couldn't be called perfect. Her alcoholic father beat up the girl on a regular basis and also taught her to be cruel. The family lived in an unsafe house where only one room was more or less non-hazardous. After her parents had another daughter, Myra was sent to live with her grandmother. Her father taught the girl self-defense methods in a rather brutal manner. He demanded that his daughter be able to fight back any offender and didn't tolerate any weakness. One day, he forced her to beat up a boy from next door who just scratched her cheek. Later, the criminal called this situation her first victory. Another shock during the girl's childhood was the death of her close friend, 13-year-old Michael Higgins. He once invited her to swim with him in a local abandoned storage reservoir, but she didn't want to go. The boy drowned there as a result, and Myra felt guilty. After this incident, the girl gradually started to delve into religion. She became a part of the parish of a local church and became a godmother to Higgins's nephew. At the age of 16, the girl got a job as a clerk in a small company. Her duties were very simple: make coffee, bring things, print documents. Despite this, she won the love of her work team from the very first days. After receiving her first salary, Myra spent it in a week and was left with no money to survive. Then, her colleagues chipped in and gave her the same amount of money as her salary from their own pockets. Around this time, the girl planned to arrange an engagement party with her boyfriend, Ronnie Sinclair, but later changed her mind. At the age of 17, she changed jobs, but didn't feel the same enthusiasm at her new place. After half a year, she was fired for constant bunking off work. Along with this, Myra attended a judo club, where even guys didn't want to risk fighting her. When she got too much into it, she couldn't stop herself in time and gave her opponents serious injuries. At that same time, Myra dyed her hair pink. The future torturers met at the Millwards Company, where both of them started to work. Myra was 19 at the time, and Ian was 23. According to the girl's diary, their first conversation took place on July 27, 1961. At first, Myra was attracted to the young man, despite his criminal record, but later lost interest in him. However, half a year after they met, Ian asked her out to the movies, and the girl said yes. The choice of movie for their first date was extremely weird: a documentary about the Nuremberg trials. This is where they connected. The couple continued to go to the movies to see the most violent films, and soon Brady made Myra extremely interested in the Nazis. They would often sit together to read different information and books about the atrocities of the Third Reich and drink German wine. Because of her new interest, Myra started to imitate the standards of an Aryan girl. She dyed her hair white and started to wear dark red lipstick. Later, she radically changed her style and started wearing more revealing and eye-catching clothes: short skirts, leather jackets, and high-heel shoes. The couple continued to work together at the same place, but they paid less and less attention to their team with each passing day. It was impossible to call their relationship perfect at that time. In a letter to her old friend, Myra once said that Ian had drugged her with sleeping pills. After a few months, she told him not to take that letter too seriously. Considering that the couple didn't have a lot of money during those years, they started to look for ways to get quick money. In the end, Ian and Myra decided to rob a bank. The girl rented a van and tried to learn how to shoot, but she failed to master this skill. Despite this, she eventually bought a rifle and 2 revolver guns. In the end, the couple decided to give up on that idea. They probably understood that they wouldn't be able to succeed without all the proper skills and experience. Instead, they got really interested in photography and bought professional equipment. But they mostly photographed each other, and the pictures were quite explicit. 2 years after they met, in June 1963, Ian moved in with Myra and her grandmother. A little later, the government gave them a new place to live because the old one was considered too unsafe. At that time, Brady voiced his deepest desire to Myra for the first time. He wanted to commit a perfect murder. He was inspired by Mayer Levin's book Compulsion, that talked about 2 teenagers who planned to kill a 12-year-old boy and escape the death penalty. The girl wasn't shocked by this revelation, but she agreed to help her lover. The plan was extremely simple. Myra and Ian decided to look for a victim near the road and then take them to some remote place and kill them. Brady told Myra to drive the van down the street on their own, while he himself followed her on his motorcycle. After finding someone who was to his liking, the criminal was going to signal his accomplice with the headlight, and she had to convince the victim to get into the car. On the evening of July 12th, just a month after they moved, they went looking for a victim. Brady chose their first victim and signaled Myra, but she drove away. After catching up with her, he demanded an explanation. The girl said that his target was 7-year-old Marie Ruck, who lived next door to her mother. According to Myra, it would be extremely difficult for them to avoid getting caught because the police would start looking for such a small child right away. After that, the couple continued to drive down the street and look for a new victim. At 8 p.m. on Foxmer Street, Brady chose a new victim. Myra recognized the girl once again. She turned out to be Pauline Reed, a 16-year-old friend of her younger sister who was heading to a party. Deciding to make her move, Myra stopped and offered to give her a lift, and the girl got into the car. To take her to a more secluded place, Myra came up with a story. She allegedly lost a very expensive glove near the Saddleworth Moor. The local residents were fond of this place because of the rich reserves of turf they could use as a fertilizer. Poor Pauline agreed to help her acquaintance. Brady caught up to them shortly after they came to that place. Myra told the girl that it was her boyfriend and he would help them to look for her glove. It's unclear what happened next. The issue is that Brady and Myra told two different versions of the events, but the result was the same. Pauline was murdered. According to Ian, he and his lover tortured the girl and killed her. Myra said that she stayed in the car and Pauline and Brady went to look for her glove. After some time, the criminal returned alone and told her that the girl was dead. He took Myra to see her body, and she noticed that the girl's clothes were quite badly rumpled. In my opinion, Myra's version of the events doesn't make any sense. Why on earth would a 16-year-old girl go to look for a glove with the guy she didn't know while Myra herself was sitting in the car? Most likely, Myra told this story to try to absolve herself of all the responsibility and make it seem like she wasn't directly involved in the murder. After burying the body, Myra and Brady loaded the motorcycle into the van and drove home. On their way home, they noticed Pauline's mother and her brother, who were looking for the girl. After a break of almost half a year, the couple decided to do something again, but this time, their choice fell on a 12-year-old boy. Noticing their victim in the store, they struck up a conversation and offered the child a ride home. To make the boy more compliant, Brady offered him alcohol. Once they were in the car, he clarified that he would have to go to their house to get alcohol. But first, the couple of criminals asked the child to help them find his non-existent glove in Saddleworth. Unfortunately, the boy agreed. Then the situation unfolded according to the same scenario. Hindley said that Brady took the child away from the car, tortured him and killed him. She once again stated that she wasn't present during the whole process. 7 months later, on June 16, 1964, the couple kidnapped 12-year-old Keith Bennett using the same tactics while he was on his way to his grandmother's. The same thing happened to him: torture and murder. The police, who at the time didn't yet suspect the existence of serial killers, first arrested the boy's stepfather, but there was no evidence against him. The criminals committed their next murder half a year later, on December 26, 1964. It's not entirely clear whether these long periods between murders were unintentional or they did it on purpose to let the police forget about the previous disappearances. We can agree that if children just start disappearing one after the other in a relatively small town, the law enforcement authorities will do everything in their power to catch the killer. But let's get back to December 26th of that year. Only a few days are left before New Year's Eve, and Ian and Myra decided to prepare another unpleasant gift for their city. This time, their plan was completely different. They found their new victim on the playground. She was 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. The criminals dropped their grocery bags near the car and asked the girl to help them gather everything. After that, they also asked her to help them carry the bags home. The girl agreed and was attacked as soon as she entered their house. The couple tortured the poor girl right in their house for a long time. When they had their fun, the sadists killed her and took her body to Saddleworth. And again, Myra insisted she wasn't present during the actual murder. If you were attentive enough, you remember that the couple lived with Myra's grandmother. Where was she when all these terrible things were happening? Early in the morning on the day of the murder, Her caring granddaughter took her to their relative's house and told her not to come home. Despite this, in the evening, the old woman still tried to get into the house, but Myra simply didn't let her in. The next day, after they disposed of the girl's body and cleaned up the house, she brought her grandmother back. The couple committed the next murder after 10 months, breaking their 6-month routine. But that's not the only thing that makes this case special. At that time, Maureen, Myra's younger sister, already had a husband, 17-year-old David Smith. Couples often spent time together, and Brady immediately liked the young man. Firstly, he was ready to listen to everything the criminal was saying with utmost interest. Discussions about the Nazis, philosophical speeches, dreams of robbing a bank, etc. Secondly, he had already managed to catch the attention of the police multiple times, just like Ian when he was his age. Even their crimes were very similar. Smith was caught breaking into someone else's house and beating someone up. Perhaps Brady saw him as a protege, a new member of their impromptu gang. Over time, the young man started to come to their place more and more often, and during his long conversations with Ian, they started mentioning murders. It got to the point where Myra started to worry that her relative might run to the police. But Brady stood his ground. He thought Smith was just like him and trusted him. Shortly before the next crime, he even told her that he and Smith would soon commit a crime together. It all happened on the evening of October 6, 1965. Myra and Brady went to Manchester Central Station in search of a new victim, and soon Ian made his choice. He met 17-year-old Edward Evans, who agreed to go to his place after a short conversation. After they got to their place, they started drinking wine, and at some point, Brady sent Myra to get Smith. After his arrival, everything started happening very fast. According to Myra, this is what happened. She went to the kitchen to feed the dogs, and Smith stayed in the living room. A few minutes later, she heard screams and the sounds of struggling. When she entered the room, the girl saw Evans and Brady fighting. After a short fight, Ian grabbed an axe and hit the victim several times with the spine of the axe. Then he put an electric wire around Evans' neck while he was unconscious and strangled him. After the murder, Brady wanted to immediately take the body to the moors, but it turned out to be too heavy. Moreover, the criminal twisted his leg during the fight. In the end, he decided to leave the body at the house and go to Saddleworth with Smith the next day. In addition, he asked him to stay in order to feel the full gravity of what happened. At first, Smith agreed to help Brady to dispose of the body. Perhaps he was too scared to say no. He only had a small list of minor violations and crimes. The young man might not have shared the sadistic inclinations of this murder couple. After he got home, he decided to tell his wife about what had happened at her sister's house. After hearing everything, she asked him to report this atrocity to the police. Smith listened to her and called the police from the nearest telephone booth at 6 a.m. His story was slightly different from what Myra would later say. The exact transcript of this call is kept in the police archives. Brady opened the door and said in a loud voice, "Do you want small bottles?" I nodded to say yes, and he walked me into the kitchen and gave me 3 little bottles of booze and said, "Do you want the rest too?" When I entered the house, the door to the living room was closed. Ian went into the living room and I waited in the kitchen. I waited a minute or two, and then suddenly I heard a horrible scream, as if a woman was screaming, a very high voice. Then the screams continued, one after the other, very loudly. Then I heard Myra shouting to me, "Dave, help him," very loudly. When I ran in, I just stood in the living room and saw a young guy. He was lying with his head and shoulders on the couch, and his feet were on the floor. He was lying face up. Ian stood over him, facing him. The guy was still screaming. Ian had an axe in his hand. He held it above his head and hit the guy on the left side of the head with an axe. I heard a blow. It was a really strong blow. It was a bone-chilling sound. Despite the fact that Ian said all of this in his usual monotonous voice, the abundance of details made the police take the call as seriously as possible. They decided to do everything carefully to get into the house without a court order. A policeman drove up to the place and caught the local baker who delivered the bread in the morning. He put on his apron, took a couple of loaves of bread from him, and knocked on the door of the criminals. Myra, who didn't suspect anything, opened the door. Then the policeman took out his ID and quickly walked into the house, where he found Brady. He was writing an explanatory letter to his boss asking for a day off because of his injury. The officer came up with the story that he was investigating a case with the use of firearms and asked to inspect the house. It's unclear why Myra agreed. He examined all the rooms except for one, the one with the body of the young man, because it was locked. The policeman asked to open it, but Myra said that she left the key at work. Of course, this story wasn't believable at all. The officer ordered to take the girl to her workplace and pick up the key, but she gave up and opened the door. When the body was discovered, Brady was immediately arrested. Before leaving the house, he told the policeman that there had been a quarrel between him and Evans, trying to present everything as self-defense. During the interrogation, he continued to adhere to his version of the events, but it sounded extremely unconvincing. Brady allegedly met Evans at a bar. A conflict ensued between them, and the young man somehow came to his house where a fight broke out. Smith was testifying against Brady at the same time, and the police thought his story was more believable. Ian later insisted that Smith was directly involved in the murder. The young man said that Ian was bragging about killing 3 or 4 children, and even named the approximate place of their burial. In addition, he told the police about the 2 suitcases with evidence that the killers possessed and collected various trophies in them. The problem was that these suitcases were kept in some unknown lost property office in Manchester. It took the police several days to find them. After the criminals were arrested, their house was scoured. There, the police found a lot of interesting things: notebooks, lists of names, photographs of Brady and Myra in Saddleworth, and their explicit pictures. The notebooks contained lists of encrypted words that the police were able to quickly decipher. It turned out that Brady kept records of burial sites, weapons, and methods of murder. Alas, it was impossible to establish the exact location of all the victims' bodies based on this information. It was rather superficial. Another notebook contained a list of names, and among them were the names of all the victims of this couple. But here's one weird thing. In addition to the victims we know, the list contained the names of other children. Having all this information, the investigators interrogated Brady again, and his story was once again not very believable. The list allegedly contained the names of his friends, and he only joked about the murders of the children in a conversation with Smith. Along with this, the police managed to find the suitcases, the contents of which shocked everyone. They contained photographs of a naked girl, her mouth tied with a scarf. They also found audio cassettes, one of which would soon become perhaps the most terrifying piece of evidence in history. It contained a recording of a poor girl screaming and asking for help, and all of this lasted 13 minutes. Other cassettes contained recordings of the Nazi plays. This girl turned out to be Leslie Ann Downey, killed by the torturers on December 26th. After listening to the cassette, the mother recognized her daughter's voice. It's horrible to imagine how difficult these 13 minutes were for the poor woman. In addition, the suitcases contained many photographs that featured the Moors, various bludgeons and whips, as well as erotic magazines. All of this, including the recording of the girl's screams and her photographs, would have been enough to charge him, but the police still had to scour Saddleworth. They faced a difficult task: to determine the burial sites of the victim from numerous photographs. They were helped by Myra's 12-year-old neighbor, who once went with them to the moors to collect turf. It's not clear why the sadists left the girl alive. Perhaps in this case, it would be too obvious that Myra and Brady killed her. 150 officers were involved in scouring the moors to find the bodies. Initially, they focused on the area near the road A628, but later, relying on the testimony of various witnesses, moved to the road A635. That's where they found the first body. On October 10th, a policeman noticed a hand sticking out of the ground. Because of the level of the decomposition of the body, the identity of the child could be established only after an examination. It turned out to be the same girl from the ominous Gazette, Leslie. Police found John Kilbraid's body 11 days later. Meanwhile, Brady and Myra were accused of murdering Leslie, and it prolonged their prison sentence. Despite such an abundance of evidence, Ian continued to give the police unconvincing stories in an attempt to avoid punishment. When asked about the origins of the nude photographs of the little girl taken at Hindley's house, he didn't deny that he took them. Nevertheless, he insisted that the girl was brought to their house by two men, and they took her away to an unknown location. Winter came, and the police temporarily stopped searching the moors, but at that point, they had all the evidence they needed to sentence Myra and Brady. On April 19, 1966 began one of the most talked about trials in British history. Both lovers were charged with the murders of Edward Evans, Leslie Downey, and John Kilbride. The turning point was the recording with Leslie's last words. As part of the court hearing, the recording was watched till the very end. The journalists present at the meeting called the tape the most terrible piece of evidence judges had ever had. The trial lasted more than 2 weeks, and on May 6th, the court found the sadists guilty, sentencing them to life imprisonment in different prisons. This was the last day they saw each other. The couple exchanged letters all the time, but over the years their passion faded away. There weren't that many letters anymore. The trial was remembered for another interesting moment. David Smith, who became the main witness, entered into an agreement with the local newspaper and pledged to give an exclusive interview if Myra and Brady were convicted. For this, the publication paid him £1,000, which was quite a big sum of money for that time. Smith and his wife spent the money on a vacation in a 5-star French hotel, and the judge was full of indignation. He considered this deal as inappropriate, but there was nothing he could do within the law. Since then, the story of Myra and Brady split into 2 separate ones, but it didn't end. By 1974, Ian managed to change several prisons until he finally stayed in Wormwood Scrubs. The most interesting thing started here. The criminal managed to abuse children while staying in prison. How was this possible? Shortly after being transferred to Wormwood Scrubs, Brady, who was placed in solitary confinement, went on a hunger strike. He wasn't satisfied with the ban on communication with other prisoners. The prison management decided that the murderer of children wouldn't survive there for too long. As a result of sharp weight loss, the criminal was transferred to the hospital wing, where his life started to change. He was allowed to watch TV and do the cleaning work. Meanwhile, juvenile delinquents with mental disorders were admitted to the hospital wing of that prison. In 1981, one of these teenagers revealed that Brady forced him into intimate contact. Later, multiple other victims made similar statements. Using his access to all the nooks and crannies of the prison as a janitor, Ian took his victims there. When the prison authorities found out about this, he was banned from cleaning the premises, but no additional charges were brought forward. What's more interesting, he was left in the hospital wing next to the same teenagers. Again, how was this possible? But the chief medical officer of the prison couldn't do anything. British laws clearly state that it's vital to provide help to prisoners, and Brady used this to his advantage. He threatened to resume his hunger strike every time it came to transferring him back to his cell. In 1982, a tough decision was made to transfer the criminal to another prison with stricter conditions. However, 3 years later, in 1985, Brady was declared insane. Because of this, he was transferred again to the Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital. Many of you might think, how could such a cruel sadist manage not only to live a comfortable life in prison, but also to keep abusing teenagers? The answer may surprise you. Earl of Longford, Frank Pakenham, one of the leading politicians of that time, helped him to get all the perks and privileges. Brady approached him while in prison, and soon the Earl was on his side and started to help him. Of course, There was no talk of helping him clear the charges, but Ian didn't expect it anyway. Pakenham helped him stay in the hospital by contacting the British Home Secretary himself. After that, the politician repeatedly helped his newly made friend by tugging all the necessary strings in the British elite circles. But he couldn't fulfill Brady's main request. The sadist dreamed of a date with Myra. On that note, let's go back a little to Hindley's story. Her life in prison turned out to be much less eventful, but not without interesting moments. In prison, she managed to find a female lover, but what is much more interesting, she was able to get out of there for a while. Sometime after the beginning of her sentence, Hindley started a passionate romance with her warder, Patricia Kearns. They planned her escape, but they were caught by the police when they were still just preparing for it. As a result, Kearns was turned from a prison employee into a prisoner for 6 years. In November 1986, Keith Bennett's mother wrote a letter to Myra begging her to tell her about the fate of her son. It was filled with pain and despair, as can be clearly seen in the last lines. "I'm an ordinary woman. I work in the kitchens at the Christie Hospital. It took me 5 weeks to write this letter because it's very important for me that it will be accepted by you as what it is, a plea to help me. Please, Miss Hindley, help me." It's impossible to say for sure whether Hindley was moved by this or she had other motives, but she agreed to take part in the investigative experiment. Surrounded by lots of guards, she was taken to Saddleworth, which was blocked out by 200 policemen around the perimeter. Myra's task was to show the places where the bodies of the children were buried, the fate of some still unknown. She didn't succeed. The searches didn't bring any results. The detectives who organized her participation were sharply criticized for the thoughtless waste of money on an event of this magnitude. However, it turned out to be useful later. One of the detectives continued to visit the woman in prison, and soon she decided to partially confess to a number of crimes. Myra told him about all the murders, but insisted that she was never actually present during the murders. Of course, no one believed this, but the detective was glad to get any new information out of her. Since then, Myra has traveled several more times to the moors, and in 1987, the police were successful, if the discovery of the body of Leslie Ann Downey and later Pauline Reed could be called a success. As soon as Brady learned about the cooperation of his former lover with the investigators, he also decided to partially confess to what he had done, but the sadist asked to give him all the necessary tools to take his own life, which the law didn't allow. After being denied this, Ian still continued with his confession and also expressed a desire to help the police in the search for the remaining bodies. On July 3rd of the same year, he was taken to Saddleworth, where he was never able to locate Keith Bennett's burial site. Later, the disappointed detectives refused to revisit the moors with the sadist, and he turned to journalists. In the letter, he directly admitted that he had killed 5 more children, but the police were unable to confirm this information. 6 months later, Brady managed to convince the investigators to take him to Saddleworth for the second time, but he didn't help at all. Keith's body hasn't been found to this day. In 2003, the police resumed their search using the most advanced technology. This didn't give any results. They only had a 40-year-old photograph with them, and it's almost impossible to find the right place just based on those photos. Myra tried to get herself out of prison for a long time. She wrote appeals, had the support of Lord Longford, and by the beginning of the 2000s, almost everyone was sure that her release was inevitable. Unfortunately for her, life decided otherwise. Hindley died on November 15, 2002, at the age of 60. The reason for this was the complications associated with heart disease. The rest of Brady's life turned out to be less cheerful. If Myra's release was seriously considered, the release of Ian was out of the question. Senior British officials couldn't possibly allow it. He was gradually going more and more insane with each passing year in the mental hospital, until he completely lost his mind, if he was ever even sane at all. Despite this, he managed to live long, to 79 years. In 2017, the sadist died from cancer, and the urn with his ashes was sunk to the bottom of the sea. Brady's death didn't really make anyone sad. His namesake, the chairman of the Police Federation branch, Ian Hansen, noted that such monsters didn't deserve sympathy. This is where the story of these child killer lovers ended, but in Britain, their names will remain in people's memory for a long time. Ian and Myra are a clear example of inhumanity, endless arrogance and cynicism, as well as a complete lack of morality.